For those of you all who might not have read the Dasgupta report, it's a great read. There's a much shorter version that you can have a look at. But I think one of the key messages from that as well was being very clear that economies are embedded in nature, not external to it, like how we've treated it for, well, since I suppose the start of capitalism. And the panel have also mentioned that one of the key elements of green infrastructure and nature-based solutions and climate finance is getting finance to the most vulnerable. So I was wondering, I can throw it out maybe to the financial institutions on the panel to start with. Could you all give us some examples of innovative types of financing that have done just that? Get some of this financing to those vulnerable groups to solve some of these key issues. Vashtie or Michael?
Okay, so about 2 years ago, we started working with an instrument called a Contingent Recovery Investment Grant. So most grants at the IDB, you can't invest in a lot of materials and infrastructure and that kind of thing. It's more on soft financing. So we came up with this investment grant, which looks like a loan, except it doesn't have any interest. And it's repaid based on the borrower's achievement of a specific set of performance targets. And sometimes if you do extremely well on those targets, the amount you repay is actually less than was advanced. So we have been able to use this together with pure grants to kind of de-risk some of these investments. This year was the first time I designed a couple of these, and I think that it's a different way of going, because you don't start paying upfront, you start paying after the project you borrowed for has been implemented, so you have like a time frame, and then it's not carrying you into like when your grandchildren get married, you pay it off in some bullet payments. And those payments are predicated on the success of the project and the model that we are proving. So we share the risk. And I think that this is, for us, it has been innovative and it has been a useful way to support, innovators that are, especially where they're trying to pilot solutions for poor people that can't afford to pay a lot of money for services, right? So you have to kind of put the whole business thinking on its head because, if you really want to have impact, you have to look at majority populations. And yes, there's the thing, if everybody pays a little bit, it's enough. But we also, in an environment where even the ability to pay a little bit has been severely constrained. So that's one way that we're trying to finance more infrastructure and more capital-intensive projects. Mm-hmm. It's repayable, but it's triggered to success, and we share the risk.
And Michael, I know Republic Bank has a $200 million US commitment. I hope I'm getting the current correct, to combat climate issues in the Caribbean. I don't know if you can give the audience any ideas about how you all plan to leverage that. What types of financing, could we expect to see coming out of that commitment?
Certainly. I can touch on the prior question just briefly as well. So how we play in the space of, I suppose, supporting economies or communities rather, is more from, at least in the team where I sit, more of a holistic assessment with the project. So for example, if we're going to build, and I won't single out any particular clients, if we're going to build a given development in a region, how much local content are we using? What is the CSR of the project in that community so that you have community buy-in? Because that is critical. As someone mentioned quite accurately before, the community can make or break your project. If we're looking at opportunities that are in rural areas, right? We look at, okay, well, what will be the virtuous impact or the multiplier effect of a hotel in this jurisdiction where the other biggest business may be a small restaurant, right? So that's, I think, that's how we add that lens of societal development and community involvement, at least from the position where I sit on the investment banking team. In terms of the Republic's commitment of 200 million, it is going well. It's quite diverse. So the 200 million applies to our global, well, not global, our regional footprint. So we have many different initiatives that would draw funding from that pool of capital across our territories. So for example, in Barbados, they have multiple wind and solar investment opportunities that have come to market. In Grenada, there's rooftop solar. In St. Lucia, there's green vehicles, electric vehicles and hybrids and so on. So a lot of different small scale initiatives that aggregate to a bigger trust, and I think allow a broad base level of participation in our economies. Of course, we're interested in the large scale as well, large scale renewable infrastructure, commercial scale RE developments. Those come to market a little bit more slowly, and they tend to have a syndicated approach in many cases, which is good, because then we pull in our whole community of financial partners to support and take part in the initiative.
Great. I'll keep my eyes out for that. Just moving on quickly to Vandana. I mean, you are very sort of into the social enterprise startup space, you know, Hello Green, Close the Loop, and so on. How have you found it as a innovative entrepreneur trying to, you know, in the sustainability space? How have you found your own engagement with obtaining or leveraging financing? And have you seen maybe traditional financing becoming more supportive, or have you had to sort of blend and mix and do the hustle, you know?
Yes, so for me, in my experience, I would say that being an SME that's not a NGO, it has been very difficult to get financing for innovation. Starting off with traditional banks, it has been a challenge for them because up until now, I know the landscape is changing. They have been very risk averse, and profits and a short investment period has been more the preference. And of course, these type of projects are very risky, as Vashtie would have said. There's a lot of elements of it where we are doing work with Close the Loop, for example. We're doing a lot of work that a private entity doesn't normally do. But we recognize that we need to set certain frameworks in place for the project to actually succeed. So for example, with waste management logistics in other territories, other countries, those things are provided for you. So you have a framework to work off of. But we're actually starting from scratch, where we're now creating that framework, getting logistics in place, and that doesn't generate profits in the short term. However, in the long term, we know that we have an end game in terms of how that's going to feed into our overall loop. Having said that, we have been able to access grant funding, where it has been a lot more supportive, not just through financial support, but as Vashtie said, it's a lot of networks, a lot of capacity building, a lot of support where we need that type of, you know, collaboration. One thing I would say is that although we do, and one of the speakers said it very rightly, there's a lot of money out there, but accessing that money has been a challenge. So right here in Trinidad, we do have a green fund. It's set up as a community-based green fund where only community projects and NGOs can access it, which I understand, you know, because you want to protect the most vulnerable who definitely cannot approach a traditional bank. However, the Green Fund has about $1 billion US. That's about 7 billion TT dollars. And I think last year, they only were able to actually disperse about $20 million from that fund. So there is a huge gap of what we actually have and can use and what we're actually using. So in my opinion, I do believe that the green fund that we have should be restructured, and you should be able to use the green fund for the intention that it was created for. Even if you're a SME or even if you're a private entity, if you're going through the rigorous, you know, checks and balances as you would if you were to go to a grant institution, then the Green Fund should be able to use those same checks and balances to innovate, to support innovative projects and support innovation in general. So what my organization is going to be doing is we recognize that we can't be reliant on grant funding in order for long-term sustainability. So we are creating our own mechanisms, our own funding mechanisms, so which will allow individuals, as well as government, as well as corporations to participate. So for example, you're purchasing something, you're purchasing an airline ticket, you're purchasing a pair of shoes, something from a local vendor, but you want to offset that purchase by planting a tree. You can't do that right now. There are no verifiable projects. You don't know if that tree is actually going to get planted. And there's no plugin, there's no framework for that. So that's where we are attempting to actually bridge that gap. So using nature as well as climate tech to enable financing mechanisms where we traditionally would not have access to that. So that was an example of an individual being able to participate. But again, with what I presented, it's about network. So we need the government participation. We need customers, which are actually corporate clients, to come to us to help project match, to help, because what we're doing is we're providing those projects now where it didn't exist before in a verifiable and transparent manner. So that's kind of how we've been able to maneuver the finance world.
Good. I'm glad you brought up government, because I think, we have the financial institutions and the multilaterals, etc. I mean, are hugely important. But I think, government drives, especially what happens in local economies and regionally and so on. So I don't know if Zay or Axel, you all can, maybe decide who can answer this. But, what would you all, I mean, we have the European Green Deal, we have all these new advances in terms of standards and the ISSB and Business for Nature and so on. What do you all think are some of the most critical messages from some of these new advances that groups like us, civil society, or even smaller financial institutions can use as a leverage point to try and push government towards maybe some more rapid action? Because like you said, it's a go green or die. I think that's the last slide. And in my opinion, not speaking for the Green Infrastructure Conference, but it's not going fast enough. I think at a state level, Vandana mentioned the Green Fund. What are some key messages that you all can give us from the different elements that you all might be more specifically involved in?
Well, I think that perhaps the most important message is to get everybody on board. Don't leave no one behind. And the quality of people reflects the quality of the institutions. So from the institutional framework point of view, you have to get it right. But then you have all the other stakeholders that should perform on a similar basis. In the European Union, we have been providing grants for many years. I mean, I guess since the beginning, since 1957, when the European Union first started. And there were changes, there were new attempts, there were different trends. But what they all have in common, I think, for success is the quality of the stakeholders. I wanted to mention during my communication, unfortunately I didn't have time, an instrument that we have now for the Caribbean, which is the LACIF, the Latin American and Caribbean Investment Facility, which is something that tries to put everybody in action. You need an institutional engagement from governments. There, it's fundamental that the rules are transparent and that are good rules, so to get the legal framework right. But then you have to fund your projects through the private sector. So the role of the private sector, PPPs, whatever schemes they might find, is fundamental. And finally, what is more important is that people, everybody, particularly the poor, get benefits from this. So I would say that in my opinion, this is what I would value in terms of priorities.
Yeah, so I think that the number one priority for any government is to ensure that its population has safe jobs and safe livelihoods, and nobody's left behind. And we have in Trinidad and Tobago, we have a budget of more than 50% is transfers and subsidies. So it is evidently clear that this is very top priority. I think many other countries have realized that this generational challenge of transitioning to a carbon neutral, nature positive, and inclusive society is the biggest single opportunity there is for jobs, right? Even in a divisive US, even they could agree. And I do not see it on any manifesto right now as a top priority. And I think what is needed is a vision to say that, in fact, that is what we could do. So all the diversification, we have a great basis. We need to create employment that generates new opportunities. And this is it. I mean, basically, you know. So I think jobs number one. And, you know, once you explain the job part, and you have laws and regulations, so it's not only a promise, it has to be a law. Yeah. And so I think we have great deficit in the legal system, in the laws, generating sufficient laws. So for example, in corporate governance domain, let's say, you know, the reason we had created the governance code in 2013 is because Trinidad and Tobago had the lowest disclosure requirements in the mapped world. Right? There is nobody else on any stock exchange that is regulated that has to say less about how they govern their organization than here, right? So we said, okay, now let's bring that up. So we created a code. Now, the ISO standard will take that up further. But basically, there needs to be basic regulation. So if you want financial institutions to invest, you need to have regulatory things. So the reason, for example, Michelle's slide, I think, had a dip in the funding going into green bonds, not only all colored bonds. There was a dip in 22. The reason there's a dip is not because demand has gone down, but because regulation has come in. So a lot of people who claimed all kinds of things are being thrown out. And so, but it will increase, you know, it will just increase again. So in the US, in kind of everywhere, people say, if you want me to invest, you need to create security. To create security, you need to give me a taxonomy. You give a taxonomy, then I know what you call it. So I'm working, for example, with the Jamaican Stock Exchange on introducing green bonds in the Caribbean, or colored bonds, all things. And, but it requires regulation, it requires all those things.
Great. I don't know if we have time for one or two questions from the audience. If anyone has burning comments or questions for our panel. Oh, I think it's over there.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Rudolph and Amji, Business Development Manager at EY, and I'm helping lead our ESG rollout. I have a quick question for the panel, and it's not meant to be loaded, but I don't have time to give you the context. Many of our clients are interested in getting into this space, but what would you all say that the private sector can do to facilitate the development of green infrastructure in relation to Caribbean integration? I mean, a lot of what you've spoken about is there are clear solutions at home, maybe in a domestic market. But from a Caribbean integration point of view, what would you advise the private sector to do to be more effective in facilitating green infrastructure development? And a quick follow-up on Axel's point about regulation. What really is being done then to advance regulations in the region to support private sector getting more involved, more effectively?
Does anyone from the banks want to take that first bit?
Sure. So just to make sure I understand the question, it's around what can the private sector do to increase resilient and climate adaptive infrastructure, essentially?
Yeah, with a focus on maybe multi-country programming.
Okay. I think that the key is around integration. So a government might build a seawall, and that might be the end of the project. But the private sector has to build a seawall that supports perhaps some sort of commercial activity that can then be used to employ people from the community, that generates a circular economy that can then go toward repaying investors. So it's a bit more complicated of an equation in terms of a private sector objective. But I think that's what we need to do in the Caribbean, and that's where the value is, right, is in bringing together all those different stakeholders. So, in short, many people said it, there's a wash of capital, no shortage of capital, huge shortage of projects. We certainly see that as well. So really work on your business plan, work on your stakeholders to bring together a proposal that, I mean, banks are happy to work with you. It's not so much, do your homework and come back. We're happy to be part of that process. So that when we do bring a project forward, it's well integrated and it's long term, it's sustainable. And that means environmentally, it means financially, from a community's perspective, and so on. That's my perspective.
So I'll also like to add, as someone from the private sector, so my company, Hello Green, we were the first company to bring compostable packaging to the Caribbean. So what ended up happening with, I did not predict this, but this is what ended up happening, is that I eventually started working with the Bureau of Standards of Trinidad and Tobago, as well as the CARICOM Regional Bureau of Standards, to now implement a regional standard for packaging. So if you're banning plastic and styrofoam, that might seem fine, but what are you replacing it with? And how do you govern that? So up until now, and actually hasn't been implemented yet, it's still in the bureaucratic phase of that. But when it is implemented, for example, every single CARICOM nation, which Trinidad and Tobago as well, you cannot import nor manufacture packaging and claim it's biodegradable or compostable without the proper certification. So now we will be protecting, all of the greenwashing, like what Axel said, having that taxonomy, having those frameworks. And what does that do? By actually having true compostable packaging, now we can invest in composting. So it doesn't happen overnight. One thing needs to feed into the other, but without the proper framework and without all of the Caribbean countries saying, you know what, yes, we've been seeing a lot of, plastic coming in as bio this and bio that, a lot of mixed messaging. And I believe integration needs to happen from the top down. So the governments need to be like, no, we're not allowed to have this anymore unless you are certified by these global standards, of all, there are lots of standards, but I won't get into that. Then you can't bring it in. And then that gives a clear message for the waste management sector, because at the end of the day, this is all to do with waste. So it's a message. Recycling is one thing, but having where to put the waste is another thing. So if you know all compostable packaging needs to be composted, then you can separate that out of the waste stream, and that can now be processed properly. And that is how Close the Loop was even born, because from selling packaging to recognizing that we need to dispose of it properly, and then all these systems in place for that, that is how private sector should think. So rethink how the products you buy, the services you provide. Are the products you're buying sustainable? Are the farmers producing it? Are they being paid fairly? We have to look internally and actually make those hard decisions, because like one of the presentations earlier, there's a greenium, like a compostable cup is more expensive than a styrofoam cup. So you have to want to pay for that. You have to value the value that these products and services bring. So that's why my perspective on the private sector is that we need to not just wait for someone to hand us the solution. We need to actually be leading the solution, because that's what government responds to, and that's that's what, I mean, we have to use our voice. So that's what I would say.
Yes, two things. I think I would like to build on what Vandana was just saying as an illustration. So I think, let me tie it back to, so I think Michael Porter with competitive advantage and that stuff, I use it all the time, but we need to remember that competition is an option, cooperation is necessary, right? So most of business is not competitive, most of business is cooperative, right? And so to create solutions for tomorrow, we need to cooperate a lot more. And I think Vandana's business, I mean, even the closing the loop is like full of cooperation. But anybody who seeks to do more than just harvest money from some windfall that somebody else pays the cost for will end up collaborating with other people because the benefits that they're seeking to create actually require cooperation. And so that is part of within the region, the most evident example of cooperation has to do with aggregation, which like Michael is speaking to. So say the projects are so small and they're so intensive for the investors. They say, no, I'm sorry, I have projects, people want billions. You're asking me for 10,000. I cannot do that, right? So I need somebody to aggregate this stuff. And we need to cooperate to aggregate and to have intermediaries who translate this money down. And we need to collaborate through, for example, standardization, regulation, which is a legal thing, right? So standardization. And that is why in many countries, businesses are the dominant force in the national standardization system because they want it. Why? Because it gives me the security for trading. I created this organization to give me security. Use it. But it means that I need to invest, I need to go, I need to be part of committees, I need to blah, blah, shape it, request it. But I think by collaborating, coming together and to say, no, we want regulation. It seems counterintuitive, but actually that's what we want, you know?
If I could, Omar, I just have a very practical answer, okay? Get a few like-minded, forward-thinking private companies that share a problem. And I think that the case for Caribbean integration comes around battling this issue of scale. Like we've had this issue of beverage containers for a long, long time, right? Everybody drinks the water bottles, the Tetra Pak, the milk, the juices, and we've built very successful businesses on being able to produce these things and sell them. But these containers are piling up, piling up, piling up. They're recyclable, but nobody's recycling them. So this is one, I mean, we've started in Trinidad and Tobago, but it's something that could scale across the Caribbean because to really have a recycling facility that can pay off an investor, they need to have enough throughput. And we can only get enough throughput if we really start bringing the waste streams from across. So that's one area. We also just work with a company that's investing in tire recycling here in Trinidad and Tobago. Now, they're going to need feedstock, not just from Trinidad, although we have 1 million registered vehicles. You go figure, like the babies are driving, okay? Guyana has, Puerto Rico has, Dominican Republic has, Haiti has. You know, so I think that uniting around common problems is probably a starting point rather than starting with government and CARICOM and all this kind of thing. Because that, I mean, how long we have a beverage container bill here in Trinidad and Tobago? Like, since I was in high school, you know, that's crazy. Let's just do it. Let's just do it. Because the sustainability of our businesses, the ability of people to continue buying goods and services is predicated on us still being here and being healthy and having an income. And that's related to the environmental, the quality of the environment that we're creating and the attendant health risks and everything else.
Yeah, so I think we will start wrapping up now. So let's have everyone give a quick 30-second takeaway for folks here related to whatever you might have spoken about or something that would have come up in conversation. So Axel, you start first and end with Michael.
Yeah. So normally when I speak with clients, when they first say, "Oh, governance, oof, you're just a pain." You know, I honestly just want to do business. I don't want no regulation. Don't come and tell me about anything else now. But then they see that actually there is so much opportunity because I've never measured this stuff. I just assume. So once you start to, so my main message is assess, commit, and transform, do something, and you will discover a world of opportunity that you just never knew you had because you never really looked. It's completely, a lot of successful businesses are actually bankrupt. They're only successful because their society pays for them. Because, you know, all the plastic can't be recycled, and it's just.
Well, I want to rebound on the role of the private sector because it was a very good question, and then in fact the role of the private sector is of paramount importance because it can be from the individual entrepreneur to SMEs to large multinational corporations, but also the consumers, because companies do not exist without clients buying their services and their products. So this harmony between the market and the rules where companies operate is fundamental. That's why the role of the state is crucial in terms of defining the rules, opening transparent rules, opening competition amongst the different players, and without distorting the market. One should not expect, for example, the case of Trinidad and Tobago, that big companies will come to invest in renewable energy if the gas used to produce electricity is subventioned. This is a distortion of the rules of the market, and this is probably why the Lara project is not yet up and running, but I know that it will be soon. So there is light at the end of the tunnel, and there is certainly a lot of hope, because hope, that's what keeps us moving until the end.
I'm just going to end by saying that there is so much creativity and talent amongst our people, amongst our young people. It inspires me every day. And this generation didn't grow up taking the environment for granted, so they really care and invest. And I'm not talking about just, 20-year-olds that have some tech app on their phone. I'm talking about, people, 30s, 40s, and if we can partner them with like experience and finance, there's no limit to what we could really achieve if we put our minds together. So let's try and encourage them. Let's try and get them to recognize, yes, partner up with somebody with the experiential capital. And I truly do believe I have a lot of hope for our region because of the energy and the creativity of the minds that populate it.
I would just like to end with, I was asked this question fairly recently, actually, and I'll repeat that answer, which was, ask yourself as an individual, how can I make an impact? So maybe you're not an entrepreneur and you don't want to do an entrepreneurial venture. You don't want to go down that path. You don't want to set up an NGO. That's not for you. But as an individual, every single person can make an impact, as cliche as that sounds. So I'll just give like one quick example to round up my 30 seconds. So a former member of staff of mine who's actually here, just working with me, admin, I wouldn't say aware of the environment, but wouldn't say they were environmentalists. And they then went on to work in a farm, a community farm in Trinidad. And the impact that they are having as an individual within themselves, their family, and the network around is really impressive. So that person, as an individual, made a decision to make an impact. And I think if each of us look at our own lives and who we interact with, the products and services we buy, the businesses we partake in, how can you make an impact? How can you make a better decision? And one better decision will lead to another and another until it just becomes habit. And I think that is how the collective can move forward. So just on an individual basis, just how can I make an impact?
Great. Well, last one in, first one in, last one out, Michael. You have the last word.
Great, thank you. My pitch will be around integration and cooperation. The commercial banks, Republic Bank in particular, is investing heavily into this space. We want to see projects. We want to support this. We want the next 5 years to be better than the last 5 years. 200 million in renewable financing, 100 million agricultural financing, expertise on tap. Let's bring the projects forward. Let's do it, right? Let's make the next 5 years worth it. Thank you.
Less than 30 seconds. So let's just give a round of applause to our panel. And on behalf of the organizers, just want to say thanks to Axel, Zay, Vashtie, Vandana, and Michael for this great panel.